Hello, good morning everyone and good afternoon. Welcome to one of the series of webinar presented by Green Story, where the topic of webinar is Decarbonization for Sustainable Fashion, Integrating Energy Attribute Certificates in Your Supply Chain. First of all, we would like to thank you so much for joining this webinar. By joining this webinar, we are pretty sure that you are pretty committed to the climate change and to do something, whether you have to do it directly from your company level at an individual level. And we appreciate that. So this webinar is mainly to understand energy attribute certificates, how you can use it through your company or individually, and how as a fashion and retail industry member, you can reduce it across your supply chain, because you may be aware, according to a UN report, fashion and retail industry accounts for more than 10% of global greenhouse gases, which is more than all the airlines emission combined. So obviously we'll have to take some efforts and do it. And this sector is so much diverse and diverted that supply chain is spread across different continents, and also no one is having a dominance of more than 1%. So going through the same thing, we have estimate speaker, Mr. Aymeric De Conde, who is head of APAC, and I will tell him to just give us a brief introduction about him. Mr. Aymeric.
Thank you, Gaurav. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Pleasure to be here. And thank you, Green Story, for inviting me here. A quick introduction. I've been in this market for now over 6 years. I started in the environmental commodities market from the US side in North America to cover the companies in North America, in the US and Canada, mostly procuring and helping those companies procure EACs and carbon credits. I later moved to Europe, where I'm from, started working at Vertis Environmental Finance, and started their climate action division there, as well as their wholesale carbon trading desk, until 2021, where STX Group acquired Vertis. And since then, I've been actually driving the Strive by STX team, which is the climate action arm of the whole STX Group for the Asia Pacific region. And for over those years, I've been helping all different types of companies from different sectors and sizes, from SMEs to Fortune 500. And so that's me in a nutshell. I'm happy to explain a bit more on the EAC market and its usage.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for your introduction. And we are very happy that you are a guest speaker at this webinar. And also we would love to know that our webinar attendees will get to know more about these EACs and how they can use it in the company and other parts. So moving forward, first we'll discuss the webinar agenda. So we'll have a brief introduction about Green Story. Then we'll move on to Strive. We'll have an introduction and the solutions which it provides under its portfolio. And based on this, whatever strategies which are useful for sustainable fashion, we'll discuss this. And accordingly, we'll have case studies or whatever beneficial studies which can be useful for our benefits. And at the end of the day, will have a Q&A session. And also, like we want to have a fruitful discussion. So if anyone has any questions, they can write in the chat box. We will definitely take it during the Q&A sessions. So your cooperation would be sought. Moving forward, this is Green Story, which is a sustainable intelligence platform, and we are a SaaS-based company based in Netherlands and having presence in India and Canada. So we have a systematic approach to reduce your environmental footprint. And how we do it: first, we try to assess the data from the customer, and when we have assessed and mapped it, we took the information from the data, put it into a system, and then calculate your impact. So based on your impact, we go for the product level footprinting, and on a monthly basis, whatever the products are bought by consumers throughout the e-commerce and other channels, we make sure that whatever the footprint is presented, we try to offset it or try to reduce it with the help of different options under eco contributions. So that's how a little step-by-step procedure, like how Green Story does it. And we all do all this through a SaaS platform. And obviously, like we have a portfolio of clients, which include Pack, Pangaya, Farfetch, BAM, Carilova, Adam, and many more. So moving forward to the eco contribution module. So this is a separate section of Green Story where offsetting and like reducing your footprint has been taken care of. Not only we have carbon credits, but we have different uh, sections where we can have plastic credits, removing ozone substances or biodiversity units. And in the similar lines, expanding our portfolio under eco contribution, we have Strive with us, who would be a new partner and who would help us to expand our reach throughout our clients. So I'm introducing Strive and will pass on to Mr. Emmett so that he can move forward on this webinar. Mr. Emmett, please.
Thank you, Gaurav. I think we can go with the next slide quickly. There you go. So before we dive in, just a quick information, right, on us, who we are, but essentially we are a leading environmental commodity trading company. We've been around for quite some time, starting in 2005. We have over 500 employees globally across 13 different offices. I sit in Singapore, looking at Asia Pacific. We trade over 50 different products. Now, of course, EACs is one of them, but we have different, very different products to be used to reduce Scope 1 to O3 emissions, also on the compliance programs across the planet. Active clients, we work with over 7,000 clients from different sectors, and our balance sheet here is something that we like to show simply because in this market, given the usual illiquidity of the products, having a nice large balance sheet allows us to provide better financial solutions when it comes to contracting and a forward contract on those commodities. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, STX Group comprises essentially of three brands, right? We have the STX as we know it. This is where all the traders and the originator of all the products and commodities that we trade sit. Again, across all those 13 different offices. We have Strive by STX. This is the team I head here in Asia Pacific. This is our climate action division. So we're the corporate account managers speaking and directly to corporates to help them understand the environmental commodity market, but most importantly to help them decarbonize and understand their options depending on where they operate. And lastly, Vertis is a sister company that has been acquired in 2021, and this company, Vertis Environmental Finance, focuses specifically on the EU emission trading scheme that has been going on since 2005. Next slide, please. Quick history. Again, we've been around for quite some time. Over 25 years in the environmental commodity market, and most importantly, the last piece here in 2023. So last year, we've expanded our team, Strive by STX, into the Asia Pacific Singapore office of the STX Group. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk about a bit of the challenges, right? Why most people here are attending. Let's talk a bit about how strategic the decarbonization is of a topic. You can go to the next slide. But essentially, as we know today, all the countries that have committed to net zero covers approximately 70% of all the total emissions, and with the average net zero targeted by 2050 as per the Paris Agreement. Now, this will require about $125 trillion of investment in low carbon technology, again, to get to net zero by 2050. And that strategy takes into account the renewables, and we need to get to 90% renewable in the global grid, right, the electricity grid, by 2050 to really get to that goal. So it's a huge increase, and renewables is a huge part of the solution to reach our goal in 2050. Next slide, please. But it's not easy, right? It's complex. It's not taking action today is not something that is a straightforward topic or solution. It is complex because now you do have a lot of regulation coming out in different regions or countries. We've seen carbon taxes, we've seen emission trading schemes, and we have even very local regulations in some countries and even some cities. The prices vary or buy a lot in different countries, depending on which commodity and which country you're in. So the volatility of those prices is not easy to forecast. And so taking action and having visibility on the carbon price or carbon exposure that every company has is something that is not something that is, again, straightforward. All prices differ globally, depending again on where you operate. You may have different options at different prices. And of course, scope 3 is the next climate action frontier. This is important because we want to focus on your scope 1, 2, but of course, the bulk of the emissions are with your supply chain, upstream and downstream. And this is something that needs to be tackled by every single company out there. Next slide, please. Looking at the regulations specifically, with time, there's more and more regulations, especially in Asia Pacific. We've seen the carbon tax here in Singapore. We're looking at Japan and the voluntary ETS there. Indonesia has launched its ETS last year already. We have also all the disclosure, right? The environmental disclosure proposals and regulations in various countries in Asia Pacific. The Chinese ETS that is ongoing, with adding more sectors onto it. In India, right, the carbon credit trading scheme is also something to be expected. Vietnam is looking at the ETS. There's more and more regulation, and this is something that now is becoming a something to manage, because every company is now going to be exposed to carbon, and that carbon exposure needs to be managed. Next slide, please. And it needs to be managed because prices differ wildly, right? This is just example, mostly in Europe, and I'll deep dive a bit more on the prices in Asia Pacific later. But you can see how volatile and how bullish most of those prices are. Look at the EU ETS, the allowance price in Europe, the generic geo price in Europe, and the biomethane as well. Depending on the feedstock, you have different prices. But these are all kind of prices that are quite volatile and needs to be managed in the future. Next slide, please. And if you look at the world landscape, you realize that if you look at a ton of CO2 that needs to be reduced, well, that has an actual price, and that those prices can differ across the globe. So again, having a good understanding of how exposed the carbon is, depending on where that company operates, is actually very important to tackle its emission and to tackle its carbon exposure with the right budget. Next slide, please. And this is a slide that gives you a good idea of how scope 1, 2, and 3, relatively speaking, across sectors look like. And indeed, 80% of the emissions, right, are coming from the upstream and downstream supply chain. The apparel here, you see that again in the middle, a lot of it is coming from the scope 3. That shouldn't be surprising given the amount of tier suppliers within the supply chain of the apparel sector. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick slide on kind of how complex, right, those environmental challenges are. So a company, a scope 1 is somebody else's scope 3, right, and on and on. So this is the example of the automotive sector, where the automotive in Europe, for example, has all the scope 1 and 2 of all the tier suppliers, all the way from the raw material sourced in Australia. So this is quite an interlinked and complex system to tackle, and really engaging with the suppliers upstream and downstream is actually very important to tackle all the emissions across the landscape. So how do we do that? You can go to the next slide. What we do here at Strive STX within STX Group, you can go to the next slide, please, is not only, of course, we help those companies measure, right, and understand how they can actually commit to science-based targets or create a net zero decarbonization roadmap, but most importantly, how to actually act and how to actually reduce those through those commodities. When we talk about environmental commodities, there's a lot of different products, as I've mentioned. Today, we'll be talking mostly about EACs, or renewable power, that you see here, energy attribute certificates. But across the globe, you have different options depending on your obviously your goal, your commitment, and where you operate. This includes energy efficiency credits, mostly in Europe, EACs that's global, and essentially at Strive we can offer every single EACs wherever there's a scheme on a regional or country basis. Renewable gas, right? Here we're talking about RNG or biomethane to lower scope 1 and replace natural gas consumption with biomethane. And then renewable fuels, right? Biodiesel, biofuels, again, for your scope 1, right? To change and change the fuel they're using. Instead of using fossil fuel, use biodiesel. And then to go further down the list of options, you look at carbon removals, you look at carbon reductions, and then you look at carbon insets to, again, help your contribute to climate project, but also reduce and compensate your scope 3. Next slide, please. So if you look at all the landscape, essentially, this is what you're trying to do. You're trying to reduce your emissions, and to be very blunt, every single company that has committed to net zero actually will not get there without environmental commodities. And renewable power is one of the first thing, kind of the low-hanging fruit that most companies tackle because it's accessible, it's mostly affordable compared to maybe other commodities, and it tackles a lot of the scope 2 emissions, and many times fully if one needs to be 100% renewable. So let's deep dive into the EAC market. These are the next slides that we can that I can explain in further detail. So yep, you can go to the next slide. So when we talk about energy attribute certificates or EACs or RECs, this is an umbrella term. Okay, energy attribute certificates is a umbrella term that essentially means the same thing as all the other type of acronyms you've heard, like a REC or like a GEO. It's the same thing. It's 1 megawatt hour of generated renewable energy. Now, depending on where you source this, the name will differ. In Europe, we talk about GEOs or guarantees of origins. In the US, we talk about renewable energy credits. In the UK, we talk about REGOs, renewable energy guarantees of origin. It's different words, different acronyms, but it means the exact same thing: 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy produced. And what is important here, especially in India, you have access to IREX, and this is in India one of the attribute that is or certificate that is used a large majority for scope 2 reduction. And this is accessible in now 55 different countries. In Australia, you have IREX as well, but also LGCs or large scale certificates. And on and on. In Japan, you also have NFCs as well, non-fossil certificates. Again, different acronyms, different name, meaning the exact same thing, right? 1 megawatt hour of generated electricity. You can go to the next slide and we can zoom in into the APAC region. So here you see a bit more detail on what type of certificates or what type of energy attribute certificates one has in terms of options in each of those countries. So wherever you see blue, there's a scheme, and this is something you have option and access to reduce your company scope 2. Okay. Next slide. All right. Here, as you can see, there's a lot of commitments, right? I've already spoken a bit about how many more commitments we have from companies. And of course, this naturally increases in terms of the demand, right? So when we look at the IREC redemption, which really means the demand side, because when a company redeems an IREC, it means that it's essentially claiming the renewable energy attribute. So that's redeemed in the actual IREC or whatever registry they're using, and that uses and that corresponds for as a demand signal. And we've seen in the last few years it's been increasing significantly. And of course, in terms of redemption in different countries, you've seen the increase here on the right side as well. Next slide, please. And of course, if you have more demand and the supply isn't literally following with that demand, prices move, right? And we've seen that, especially in the last couple of years, where prices in various countries have actually increased significantly. These are not prices that have been updated recently, but it gives you an idea of how much kind of what we're talking about, how much increase this looks like. And when we compare this to, let's say, the geo price in Europe, where that market is a lot more liquid with a lot more volume, we can potentially foresee that in Asia, or at least in the Asia Pacific region, this could reflect a bit what's going on in Europe, right? Where it's very volatile and that demand can pick up really quickly, and the supply, of course, lagging behind. This can have diverging prices and mostly very bullish prices. So in order to kind of hedge your exposure on prices, it's good to understand this market and understand why there's an increase and understand what are the options to actually hedge your exposure and actually have fixed prices for the future. And I'll explain that later on, what we offer on those. Next slide, please. So for some of you, this may be new. I'm happy to cover a bit what is the actual usage of EACs. Essentially, it's to reduce your scope 2 market base. So here I have two companies, company A, company B. Company A decides not to purchase any renewable energy. Their current scope 2 location base is 93 ton of CO2. And this is using the grid emission factor, and this is looking into the average of all the consumption of that company in different markets: India in this example, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, as you see in the map. Now, company B decides to actually purchase unbundled EACs, right? Those EACs we've been talking about, to reduce its scope 2 market-based. So as you see in the table, you have the line per country, you have the technology, right? Where is that energy certificate coming from? Is it a wind or solar or hydro? All the type of technology you have as a available technology you have in those countries. The volumes, so that company decides to go 100% renewable. And at the end of the day, with different prices, it comes down to, in this case, let's say $157,000, and that company can now actually be 100% renewable, market-based. So that's how those energy attribute certificates are used, again, according to the GHG protocol, and always using the GHG protocol as a reference to measure emissions and report emissions. Those EACs are used to report the market-based scope 2 reduction under the GHG protocol. Next slide, please. So how do we actually, with all those prices, they're diverging, etc., how do company now can actually ensure that whatever they have budgeted, they can, somehow hedge their exposure and hedge their their financial exposure on that renewable energy purchase. And what we often offer to our clients is a fixed price over a longer period. So depending on some countries, companies may purchase, actually, instead of purchasing every year or even twice a year or quarterly, they actually have the option in many countries. And again, thanks to our expertise, our trader, but also our balance sheet, we're able to offer long-term forward contracts at a fixed price over years from 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 10 years. So that allows all the corporates to actually understand and have visibility as to how much they're going to be spending on renewable. And and this is something of importance because it's not something that 5 years ago mattered much, or it was always useful, but now it really does, because there's not only a lot more demand, but the prices are increasing all across the board. So being able to fix that over a long period of time, this is something that allows a lot of companies to budget correctly and lock in a price for the foreseeable years. Next slide, please. And I want to take a concrete example of a recent client that was looking essentially to optimize its budget, right? They had a budget. They wanted EACs that were RE100 compliant. I'm not going to deep dive in the details of this, but essentially RE100 is a best practice procurement method. And they have specific requirements in terms of which EACs companies should purchase to make the claim as per the RE100. The volume is always estimated, right? And this is something that is important, right? Because if you consume 100,000 megawatt hour this year, you don't know if you're going to consume the exact same volume next year. So being able to actually have some type of flexibility in the volume and have this set in the contract, that's actually very helpful for companies, because if you're trying to decarbonize, then you should maybe expect to have maybe less consumption. If you were looking at your energy efficiency throughout the year, you should maybe consume less, or maybe you're expanding your operation, so actually you want to consume more. So it's all estimates, and being able to have a flexible volume percentage across those years in that contract, this is something that we can also offer. This client specifically required multiple redemption once every year for their consumption, and they specifically wanted an additional label, in this case, eco energy label that you see the logo here on the right side. So what essentially that came out to is a long-term agreement with a fixed price over those 4 years. They had the choice. They didn't want to, but they had the choice to actually take and purchase EACs from a specific asset, so from a specific wind farm or solar farm. That's something that they chose not to do, but this is something that we can provide as well as an option. And this essentially very much reflects or mirrors a VPPA when you think about it. We provided the eco energy label for those specific EACs, and most importantly, we were able to provide a flexibility of plus or minus 30%. That means that if they expected to consume 100,000 megawatt hour a year in the next 4 years, but weren't really sure exactly what was the final amount every year once they do their measurement and get their final utility bill of the year. They have the actually options to only purchase either 70,000 or 130,000, right? Based on that 100,000 estimated volume. And that's a big differentiator, because of course a lot of companies then potentially estimate not accurately, so maybe they end up over purchasing or not purchasing enough, which makes them having to go back to market and purchase more, or actually trying to sell those. So it's a bit of a headache when you think about it, and if you're not accustomed to this market. And of course, we had multiple redemption. So that was just a kind of an example of an Asia Pacific client of ours that was actually asking all those requirements, and this is something that we can we could provide on a contract and throughout 4 years. Next slide, please. So in terms of how does it actually work, right? You have to, every company before they come to us, it's always great to have an understanding of exactly your specific, right? What volume are you looking for, right? How much do you estimate? What technology? Do you have a preference? Do you prefer wind, solar, hydro? Usually those technologies have a price difference. Hydro usually being more affordable, wind and then solar being a bit more expensive. Being able to understand prices, right? So always coming to us to get prices and being able to help budget throughout the year or the next couple of years. Understanding the impact of the regulation, especially in Asia Pacific, where you have a lot of markets, especially the power markets, that are becoming slightly more liberalized and a bit and changing with green tariff options and providing PPA options, etc. And those have an impact on EAC prices. So understanding that and being prepared for it, being able to also hedge your exposure in potential bullish markets, that's extremely important. And of course, having your internal team and procurement team understand, right, on the prices of those EACs. Now, in terms of preparing, again, it's understanding a bit more what you're actually looking for and why do you want those specific criteria for your EACs, right? Being prepared, understanding your volume, understanding do you want an additional label or not? Why do you need those additional label? So it's really understanding and navigating all those different specific criteria for all the EACs. And again, this is what we do on a daily basis, and here to assist any company looking to procure EACs for their scope 2 reduction. And understanding when do you actually need your EACs, right? EACs, the whole process is you have a contract, let's say with us, and then the delivery date is the date we deliver, and that delivery looks like a simple PDF that is extracted from the registries themselves, proving, and this is something very important that you need because every auditor will ask you this. If you claim renewable energy consumption, you need proof, and that's the proof. The delivery of what you're getting is a PDF with a unique code that proves that those EACs have been retired on your behalf for your consumption. And with that, you can actually claim rightfully the green attributes and your renewable energy procurement. Um, um, yep. So understand those criteria and understand your date of your need, because if you run through a calendar year or your fiscal year, maybe you want to buy now, but you don't need them until the end of your fiscal year. And having a bit of leeway between the contracting date and the delivery date actually provides a bit more time for everyone to prepare. So also respecting the timeline and giving you a bit of margin between the the two dates, between the contract date and the delivery date. Next slide. Yeah, and I'll finish up with a few client cases, maybe that will give you a bit more context and, and help you, yeah, clearly understand what value add does this bring to the table to many companies. So I have three examples. You can go to the next slide, and we can start with a large Spanish retail clothing company. Um, in that case, essentially, the company, for some reason, have a different procurement team across the globe in different countries. You can see it here; it's 93 countries, and many countries were actually giving the mandate to procure by themselves the renewable energy. Now, of course, it makes everything complicated because it's not really centralized, right? So we actually proposed that to the client to actually centralize all the EAC requests, right? So getting the information of the energy consumption of each of those countries, and based on their targets that year, understanding how much EAC they actually required. Um, when you and that was obviously very helpful because every single country and each of those procurement teams in those countries, they don't necessarily have the same understanding of the procurement guidelines and even the EAC market. So none of them were really aligned. So one region was asking for something, the other region was asking for something that was a bit different. So the type of EACs were not consistent and homogeneous across the company. So being able to centralize that solution and centralize all the ESG requests allow the company to actually purchase once, all at once. So that's something to think about if you're looking to procure EACs, understanding what is the process and how do you manage this internally. Do you procure everything centrally? Do you divide by region? Again, every company is very different. We see a lot of time either it's centralized by HQ or whatever procurement team or sustainability team, or they divide this by region, APAC, EMEA, LATAM, US. So we see a bit of both, and sometimes it is decentralized, and sometimes that's their choice. And we obviously being able to help them across the different continent is also fine. But this is something that made the process a lot more efficient in terms of procuring EACs. Next slide. This is a bit closer to home, right? Sri Lankan apparel company looking to buy EACs, also because they were feeling the pressure from their clients in Europe, um, asking them to decarbonize their scope 2 so that their client could actually also reduce their scope 3, right? Someone's scope 2 is someone else's scope 3. The knowledge on the ESC market, right? And this is something that we see a lot is they want to buy ESC, they just don't know how, and they need to buy because their clients back in the US or Europe is asking them to act on their decarbonization roadmap and take action and decarbonize. And many times ESCs again is the first option that companies have and the most affordable option, kind of the low hanging fruit option to start looking at reducing emission on the scope 2. So having to provide, meetings and deep dive into the EAC market, just like I'm doing here with all of you, is something that we've been doing specifically for this client, so they could actually secure renewable energy and procure the right EACs, given the guidance of their client, and ensure the commitment to their client in Europe in this case. Next slide. And lastly, that was a Singaporean HQ'd e-commerce platform, as part of their science-based target commitment that they've already committed, and now they're taking action on it. They need to essentially cut by half by 2030 their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So again, renewable energy for their scope 2 is very the kind of the go-to low-hanging fruit option. Cost was, of course, a key factor. Given the client only had to be 100% by 2030, right? It's kind of a ramping up of ambition, right? Where you want to be cut in half by 2030, right? Your scope 1 and 2, but you're doing this gradually, right? So understanding a bit your expected volume in the next couple of years, and having this estimated volume in order to procure correctly each year. That was something that we had to prioritize per region, and given that each region, right, have different prices, we wanted to start with the most affordable region. So if you have 5 countries where you operate, why don't you just start with the, let's say, most affordable or cheaper option, and then ramp up from there, right? Or lock in prices now for the next couple of years. And this is essentially what we did. So we helped them kind of hedge their future renewable energy needs, and locking that volume and price for the long-term 2030 target. So these hopefully, 3 examples that hopefully speaks to some of you, or maybe you have the same problems. And I think, this is, I believe, my last slide. So we can move to the Q&A section. And happy to deep dive in further.
Thank you, Mr. Aymeric. Like that was a very detail oriented about EACs, and obviously like our attendees would have like greater knowledge than before this webinar about EACs. So moving forward to question and answer session. Let's see what questions we have. One thing about EACs I want to ask, like, is there a expiry term for EACs? Like, suppose there is one IREC of 1 megawatt hour, and is there a time period allotted to it? And if yes, like, is banking allowed in EACs?
Yeah, so this is essentially a voluntary market, right? So you have best practice and you have guidance. The best practice is essentially to match the generation as close as possible to your consumption. What we usually see and what is usually recommended is we do this on a yearly basis. Now, if you look at the US, which has a specific guidance and certification for some of the recs called the Greenie certification, in that standard, which is kind of the reference standard when it comes to the validity of those EACs, is you have a 21 months window, meaning that if you are in 2024 and you want to consume renewable energy from January to December of 2024, right? So let's say you consume 10,000 megawatt hour, you have the choice, again, as best practice, to purchase EACs that have been generated 6 months before, so from July 2023 up to December 2023, 12 months of the reporting year, January 2024, December 2024, and 3 months from the future year, 2025. So just the first quarter, January, February, March. That's the 21 months window that is usually acceptable or accepted when it comes to purchasing EACs for your reporting year consumption. But none of those expire per se. In the geo market in Europe, they do expire depending on which registry and country we're talking about. On the IREC side, on the US side, they don't expire.
Okay. So that makes sense. Like we can use it depending on vintage, like whatever year that is produced.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And moving on, like Is energy carrier certificates regarding technologies like green hydrogen, green gas, sustainable aviation fuel, like are those also included under EACs?
No, EAC is usually referred when we talk about like electricity. Now,
Okay.
some market players are referring EACs as a general term for all the commodities, but in our kind of language within the market players or practitioners of the environmental commodity, EACs are mostly referred for the renewable energy type of certificates.
Okay.
So
So,
SAF, hydrogen, that should be slightly different.
and also I think like in US there is a commodities market. So I think that is also different, or it's similar on a similar line.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, in US and North American regions, we have commodities market. So where like 1 ton of natural gas is traded, I think RIN, it is called RN or something. So are those under EACs also, or like they are different?
No, because there's a difference in talking about certificate market and the physical commodity.
Okay.
So when we talk about the electricity market, we have the physical power, and then we have
Hmm.
the certificate that is generated when that renewable power is physically generated. That certificate exists, and of course, it's on registries, right? So it's not physical per
Hmm.
se; it's a digital certificate that corresponds to a physical generation of a megawatt hour. Um, and these can be bundled together, right? Like a PPA. If some of you've heard of what a PPA is, it's electricity, physical electricity delivered to your factory or office with the certificates. But in many cases, that certificate can be unbundled and can be sold to another counterparty, as long as, of course, whoever is using that power from the facility cannot claim it's using green electricity because that certificate is not coming with the physical power. So that's why if there's a PPA, VPPA, green power, green utility, everything, anything that is renewable energy, you cannot claim that if you do not have the certificate retire on your behalf.
Right.
Uh,
It,
so one more question, like when we talk about pricing of these certificates, so how does these prices vary? Like, would the same certificate in India would be priced lesser than the one which is in Europe? So how would the price vary based on geography?
Yeah, well, it's simply supply and demand, right? Extreme examples would be in China, right? Usually very low in price simply because there's a lot of renewables. It's one of the country with the biggest IREC issuance. And then comes to Singapore, where it's a city, no space for any wind or solar project that are sizable, lots of consumption because it's a big city. Prices are very high because there's just very little supply and there's a lot of demand. So, and you have different, of course, markets where um, you have utilities or governments, state-owned utilities that are also um, looking to kind of have a piece of the market and looking at different type of certificates. So there's only a part of the IREC of part of the market where IRECs can be issued, which causes sometimes a price hike because the supply is getting lowered in that market. So depending on the market dynamics and mostly supply and demand, you have the very different prices.
okay. Moving on to next question. Karen has asked like, does this commodity trading take into account the relative carbon impact of the textiles used to create the fashion linen, cotton, wool, like natural fibers versus fossil fuel based synthetics? So I think
So,
she's, yeah, please go ahead.
so if I understand well, so how does that impact essentially the embedded emission of your product?
Yeah, yeah.
That's the right. Okay. Um, so just like you're measuring your company's emissions, um, you're when you manufacture apparel, you have a process, and that process in this case uses electricity, and you have to allocate the renewable energy um, the same as you allocate it to your process. So if you have 50% electricity within your facility that is renewable, then that garment or whatever apparel you're manufacturing should have 50% less of scope 2 in that process embedded emission. So going back kind of to the LCA, right, the life cycle assessment, you take that and you allocate it per volume of manufactured good that you're making. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yes, like I think so. It does take into account like how we want to do it, like not in the trading part, but in the assessment and the footprint part, we do take into account.
Yeah. So if you manufacture a shoe, right, a tennis shoe, and you're using 100% renewable energy, well, the embedded emission of that tennis shoe is actually much lower, right? If you look at the LCA assessment, compared to a shoe that is using, let's say, fossil fuel energy for the manufacturing process.
Okay. Moving on to next question. Like how much geopolitics play into the pricing of EPACs? Like we see, like obviously we have different regulations and different tensions across countries. So does that impact EPACs?
APAC, Asia Pacific?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course it does. Again, countries are having their well, first of all, are they pushing for renewable energy? Is there projects? Is there policies that encourages renewable energy plants to be built in that country? You have some countries where there's an actual rec market, right? A compliance market, just like you do have in India, for example, or in or in Philippines, in Australia, where you have a compliance market where utilities actually have to sell a certain percentage of renewable energy. And so, depending on which country you're buying from, this has again an impact on price, given the existing regulation and the existing supply and policies that are either encouraging or not encouraging renewable energy plants to be built.
Okay, makes sense. So I think like we have enough questions of now. I think we can move forward. Like in case you have any interest and leads, so do let us know. We'll pass it on to Emirates, and accordingly, like we can work out whether how to reduce your scope 3 or scope 2 emissions directly. So thank you so much, attendees, and hope you had a good webinar. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.